Hello, I'm Alistair Taylor. I'm here again. Hope you're enjoying the other tapes, and you're going to enjoy this one. It's all about Brian. This tape is especially about him, because he was a very special man. And I often get asked, how on earth did I ever get involved with him in the first place? Well, I was working in a timber merchant's in Liverpool called William Evans, smashing people. But I hated it. What we did was buy timber, so you'd get all the documentation for a shipload of timber arriving. We handled all that, but we never saw anything. We just sat in an office. We never saw a piece of timber. And I was utterly bored. I'd been in retailing up to that point, and I wanted to get back to it. And I was very newly married. It was 1960. And Leslie, bless her, said, if that's what you want to do, it's probably less money, but, I'd rather you be happy than be as miserable as you are at the moment. So I started looking in the Liverpool Echo, the legendary Liverpool Echo. And one evening, an ad appeared, and it said, young man wanted for record sales in city centre record shop. Apply in writing to Brian Epstein, NEMS Limited, Whitechapel, Liverpool. Now, I knew of NEMS. I mean, it was the greatest record shop in the north of England. I'd shot there. So I thought, wow, get back to retailing and records, because I've been buying records since I was able to put a turntable on. So I wrote off, and I got a nice letter back saying, would I like to come for an interview? And he interviewed me upstairs on the first floor where his office then was, and absolutely charming, immaculately dressed, which is one of the memories I always have of Brian. Always immaculately dressed, whether it was 3 in the morning or 6 in the morning, whatever. And I had a smashing interview with him. And he sat back and he said, Mr. Taylor, I don't think I can really pay you enough just to be a shop assistant. But I've been toying with the idea of having a personal assistant. He said, would you be interested in that? And I think it was £10 a week, if I remember rightly. Well, I didn't need asking twice, as you can imagine. And we shook hands on it there and then and said, right, I can start in a week. And it should have given me a clue as to what was to come in the future, because as I stood up to go, he said, oh, by the way, see those posters on the window ledge there? So I said, yeah, and they were rolled up. He said, I'd like you to get those framed for me. And there were 3 bullfight posters. And I said, yeah, what sort of frame do you want? I'll leave it to you. Look forward to seeing you a week on Monday, or whatever it was. And I hadn't even joined him then. And I got them framed at the Christmas party, the staff party for NEMS. He handed me this gift wrap thing very secretively, and he says, put it under the table, because he never gave presents out. And I got it home and opened it, and it was one of these posters framed that I'd had done for him. And in fact, that was only one of 2 presents he ever gave me. I still have that poster. When I sold a lot of my memorabilia, that one certainly never even entered the frame. It's a little, I suppose, not tatty, but it's very special. The only other time, he'd been over in America, and as always, I went to Heathrow to meet him in. And the flight was delayed. There was thick fog, and the plane had landed at Shannon in Ireland. And I waited at the airport, and waited, and it was hours late. Finally, it landed, it came in, and Brian was there, and in the limo going back to his house, he sort of very sheepishly, slightly embarrassed, handed me this little box, and he said, I knew you'd be waiting for me. He said, that's just a little thank you. And it was 3 of the most beautiful, pure Irish linen handkerchiefs, white handkerchiefs. And that's the only other time that Brian gave me a present. And he was even embarrassed at doing that. That's the man. What made Brian a great record retailer? And I've said, ever since it all began, that pop management's gain was record retailing's loss, because he was the most brilliant record retailer this country is ever likely to see. Not only did he have this amazing nose for hit records, which I can give you example after example about, but he also had the most brilliant stock control system. In fact, people came up from London to try and suss out why he was so good. And what we had for albums. Obviously, only the jackets went out into the boxes for the public to look through. And the actual discs were put into brown cardboard record containers. In the corner of each one, there was a coloured piece of string. Classical were red, I think. Blue were for musicals. Green was pop. And there was a tag on the end of it and a paper clip. And there was a stock card clipped onto it so that all you could see was this wall of brown edges all standing up, a little bit of string showing. And when you sold a record, you left the string hanging out. And that was one of my jobs. Every evening when we closed, I would go through looking for these strings hanging down. And we knew that record had sold. We could look at the stock card. Sometimes there were 3 or 4 in stock. If there wasn't, we'd weigh up whether we needed another one, whether we needed 3. And it worked. So Brian could keep total, utter control right down the line. And if you could have seen it when Christmas was coming up, God, dear me. I've seen us having to climb over boxes of records. And I always remember, one that sticks in my mind in particular, was the LP of South Pacific. And Brian ordered something like 700 copies or something crazy. And I said, Brian, you know, what on earth? And he said, you just wait. This is my first Christmas. And I think we actually sold out prior to Christmas, you know. And in fact, in those days, he would listen to a record, and the reps used to come round with demo singles, and they'd play them to us and say, yeah, okay, 2 of those, because that's 1 for each shop, 2 of those, and then Brian would say, oh yes, that's a big one, 250. And it got that the reps would then ring EMI or Decca or whoever and say, Brian Epstein's ordered 250, and they'd double up the pressing order. They followed Brian. If Brian ordered big, they knew it was going to be big. So let's say they'd ordered a 5,000 run. They would say, right, make it 10,000. Mr. Epstein's ordered it. That's how good he was. Brian was accused of not being a good manager. Basically all to do with merchandising and making money. But what everybody seems to forget is that in those days, merchandising was an unknown quantity. Nowadays, they make more money on tour from merchandising than they do on seat tickets. But in those days, he had other people. Because bear in mind, by this time, we had an enormous stable. I hate using that word, but there's no real other word for it. Because not only did we have the Beatles, but we had Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Tommy Quickly, Sounds Incorporated, The Foremost, and, of course, Miss Showbiz herself, Cilla Black. So we had a lot on our plate. But why I maintain he was the greatest manager, and he never gets enough credit for it, actually. And I'll say it now, not even from the boys themselves. I don't think anyone appreciated his foresight, his knowledge, his belief. But when I'm pushed and asked why do I think he was the greatest manager, Brian totally revolutionised the art of management. Because his basic philosophy. Now bear in mind this is a guy who just runs some shops. He maintained that his artists, all of them, not just the Beatles, all of them, all they had to do was concentrate on their performance. Every other worry or thought was handled mainly by me. So every week they would get a gig sheet which spelt out where they were playing, the name of the hotel I'd already booked, transport arrangements, all the bills coming back to the office. So all they had to do was be there on time, even to put down even the electrical equipment that was going to be available to them and made sure that it was there. So all they had to do was get in the van, drive to the gig, do the gig, stay at the hotel, move on or come back, whatever. All the bills came back to us. And that was absolutely unknown in those days, and it's still happening today, I know, that agents and managers will just say, oh, by the way, you're playing in Plymouth tomorrow night. And that's it. They've just got to work out their own way to get there. Obviously, the artist ended up paying for the hotel and their petrol and so on. But let's say that they were having a quiet week. So they could owe us, let's say, £500. And if they only earned £500 in a quiet week, then that's it. They got the £500. If they earned 1,000 the following week, Brian would say, OK, we'll take 300 of the 500 that they owe us out of this week. So they got £700 instead of the 1,000. He made sure that his artists never had to worry. I mean, I've actually known artists with other managements who've had a gig and they didn't even have the money to pay for the petrol to get to the gig. Brian would have gone ballistic if that had happened. And that, to me, is what made him a very special manager. One of the reasons he sacked me once was that, for instance, like Monday night, you've got a gig in Exeter. Tuesday night, you've got a gig in Glasgow. Wednesday night, you've got a gig down in Plymouth. Now, that meant zigzagging up and down the length of the country. That was not allowed. Brian would turn gigs down. It had to go in a complete logical sequence. In other words, they weren't retracing their steps. You could do the country and end up back where you started, but there'd have to be a lot of gigs in the middle so that it was a perfectly circular tour. And I once made the mistake. I was doing some booking because our main booker was off ill, I think, and I took a couple of bookings for the foremost. I did exactly that, and it was one of the reasons that Brian sacked me, one of the several. But he was a very special guy, and it hurts me when I see comments. OK, I'm going to be slightly controversial for once. I was very upset when Paul was opening LIPA, his college in Liverpool. And in an interview, he actually said that in the beginning, he was saying what he wanted his students to learn and to teach them, not just playing music, but management and everything else. And his comment was, in our early days, we were ripped off. Now, I wrote to him actually to say, excuse me, Paul, who are you accusing of ripping you off? Naturally, I never got an answer. But that is about the last thing to say about Brian. And I just hope, I've got to believe, that he didn't mean Brian, that he meant other promoters or whatever, or possibly even before Brian. I hope he didn't mean Brian, because the last thing that Brian would do was rip anybody off. Certainly not his artists, because he loved them all so much. One day, my intercom went, "Can you come in, Alistair?" So I went into his office, and sitting there was a mini idol of mine, the late Frankie Howard, the comedian, with that lugubrious face, sitting slumped in the chair. Brian introduced me, and he said, "Frankie's got a problem, Alistair." He said he wants to go on holiday, like in the next couple of days, and he says he can't get anything available. So I said, yeah. So Frankie Howard interrupts. He said, "Brian, I've told you, I've tried my travel agent, various other travel agents, and there is nothing available at such short notice." And always remember, this sounds slightly egotistical. It's one of the finest compliments I ever got. And Brian just sat back in that big leather chair and he said, "Frankie, Alistair can do the impossible in 24 hours. Miracles take him about a week." It was gorgeous. It was one of Brian's treats. He was going off to the south of France, just outside Nice, a wonderful hotel called Capistel, with Mummy and Daddy. He always, up to the day he died, it was always Mummy and Daddy. And Brian was going off with them to the south of France. Now, occasionally, he would ask Wendy Hanson, his PA, to take some papers out and whatnot. And he called me up from his flat. He was in Wadden House then, his Muse flat. Would I come over? So I went over a couple of days before he was going. And we talked one or two things through. And he said, right, he said, "I've got some papers I want bringing out at the weekend." So I said, "Well, Wendy does that." No, I've had a word with Wendy. She's perfectly happy, like you to bring them out. And it was typical Brian. So I organised it. And I said, "I'm coming on the night flight, so don't book me a room at the hotel when I arrive, because I'm arriving at dawn." "No, right, Alistair, right." So off he goes with Mummy and Daddy, and the weekend came, and I got my night flight out to Nice. And I came out through the airport, And there was a most beautiful Rolls Royce waiting for me with a chauffeur. And I got in, and it was like, Mr. Taylor, yeah, Mr. Epstein sent the car for you. He said, I'm told that I've got to take you the beautiful route, the Corniche route. Mr. Epstein says you will enjoy that. So we cruised along this fantastic French coastline, pulled into the hotel, something like 5 in the morning. The door immediately is opened, and there's a night porter there. Would you like to come to your room? And I said, Mr. Epstein hasn't ordered a room for tonight. Oh, yes, he has. Sure enough, I had a beautiful suite at this hotel. So the next morning, we'd arranged to meet for breakfast. And Brian had a little chalet. There were about 6 of them, right on the sea edge at this hotel. Fantastic hotel. And we worked very, very hard, virtually all day. But lunchtime came, and he said, come on, Alistair, we've done very well. Let's go and have a drink. So I marched up to the hotel with him and went into the bar. And I said, Brian, please let me at least buy you 1 drink for this little trip. It's super. All right. So I said, usual gin and tonic. Yes, please. So the barman came up and I said, 2 gin and tonics, please. So he serves them. And I went with my money and he said, no, sir. I said, excuse me, please don't put these on the bill. I want to pay for these. No, sir. So I said, Brian, will you explain to him? So Brian just sitting there with this smile on his face. I'd forgotten this till now. And I said, look, excuse me, I want to pay for these drinks. And he looked at me and he looked at Brian. And Brian just smiled. And the guy said, we have instructions that you are to pay for nothing while you are here. And he'd instructed the hotel staff that I was not to pay for anything. That, again, is a generous man. And then, what I didn't realise, for once, we went and carried on working, and he said, right, are you going to say hello to George and Patty? I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, they're in the chalet at the far end, the last one in the line. And George and Patty had secretly gone out there, and they had their own chalet. We didn't see them after that. I mean, I went and we had a drink, we sat and had a giggle. And I said, I didn't know you were here. He said, oh, nobody knows we're here except Brian. And Brian had fixed it up. And they went their way. I didn't see them again till I came home. And again, that night, we finished working and went and showered and had dinner. And he said, right, Mummy and Daddy and I are going to the casino this evening. If you can come with us, or you can hire yourself a car, you can do what you like, Alistair. I said, I'd love to. I've never been in a French casino before. So he says, right, come with us. We went off, and he even insisted, I think it was 2 francs, you had to become a member. He said, bring a passport. And apparently once you're a member, got permission, it's for life, for something like 2 francs. He insisted on paying that. And as we were going into the casino, he slipped an English fiver in my hand. He said, go and change that. Have a little gamble on me. I said, well, I love roulette, Brian. So he says, right, I'm going up to the big table. He was playing chemin de fer, because he was a great gambler. And he slipped with no fuss at all. Nothing. He just slipped it into my hand. He says, go and play roulette. He says, have fun. He said, back number 7 for me. And every week, for instance, on the lottery, number 7 is one number that always goes on my ticket. He was such a generous man in so many ways. And his parties were absolutely wonderful. I remember when I had to ring Leslie up and tell her that Brian was dead that Sunday morning. And the first thing she said was, over the phone, she said, oh, I'll so miss his parties. Then she burst into tears, because everything was always absolutely right. It sounds silly these days, but when you go back to those days, at the dinner table, there would be glasses full of cigarettes, tipped and untipped. Everything was always absolutely perfect. Probably the greatest one, and possibly the greatest party I've ever been to, was one of Brian's. And it was when he was in Wadden House in the Mews, the flat, before he bought Chapel Street. And he came one day and he said, Alistair, there's your invitation, and this beautiful card. And it was Brian Epstein at home, right? And I said, oh, that's nice, Brian. Rather old-fashioned way of putting it. He said, oh, it's going to be great. I said, right, what do you want me to do? Nothing. I am doing all this. I said, well, come on, let me help you. No, no. I said, okay. I said, but the flat's not very big. He said, Alistair, it's all organised. He said, I'm having a tent on the top of the flat roof of the Mews. I said, oh, great. You know, and those are his words, a tent. So the night of the party came round, and Leslie and I trolled off, all in our best bib and tucker, and up the stairs. And he had to climb up almost a ladder to get onto the roof. And we walked in, and the whole 2 roofs were encased in pink and white canvas, a huge marquee, and down every column, every few yards, were carnations from floor to ceiling, and a little tiny dance floor, and gold chairs. And one memory I have of it in particular, as the party got into full swing, and everybody in the pop world was there. The boys had made him a never-ending tape of their stuff, other people's stuff. It just kept playing. Judy Garland appeared, and, as I say, just everybody. There's 2 endearing things. One, it was Leslie that spotted it first, and Harry and Queenie, his mother and father, were sitting there. And the expression on their face all night was like so much pride that this was their son, who'd been a bit of a letdown in some ways because he'd been slung out the army because of nervous problems. He'd chickened out of drama school, but here he was at the top of the heap, and the look on their faces was just unbelievable. And the other one that sticks in my mind is that we went through the separate little section, and there was this enormous bowl of caviar. I'd never had caviar before. I had to have some of this stuff. And that bowl, we left at 4 o'clock in the morning, finally, and that bowl never was empty. It just kept coming. The champagne kept flowing. At one point, because the music was quite loud, and policemen appeared at the top of the stairs. So I jumped up, always ever on duty, and I said, anything wrong, officer? This is about 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, well, we've had some complaints about the noise. So I said, oh dear. I said, well, you can see his eyes are popping out of his head. I mean, he's just seeing all these stars, all under one piece of canvas. So he said, yeah, I understand. So I said, hang on a minute. So I went and got a bottle of champagne. I said, there you go. Take that, you and your mate, have a quiet drink round the corner. Thanks very much. Is that Judy Garland over there? I said, yeah, it's Judy Garland over there. Wow, don't worry. Disappeared. And they kept coming back about every hour till 4 o'clock in the morning. They got a bottle of champagne every time. So I think 2 pissed policemen that night. And we left about 4. The party was still in full swing. And I always remember we were driven home by Tony Barrow and his wife. And Tony was absolutely paralytic. Leslie made me promise I'd never drive with Tony again. He had a Mini, and he was going round corners on 2 wheels. I mean, it was utterly unbelievable. Well, we'd driven about a mile away from Wadden House, and Tony suddenly slammed the brakes on. He says, look! And we looked back. In fact, we all got out the car, and all you could see in the sky was this incredible... It was like something that, Steven Spielberg might do. All you could see was this marquee, as it were, suspended in midair. And you could still see it, and you could hear the music still from there. So no wonder they complained. But it was just one of those nights that could never happen again. Nothing will ever, ever replace that. I mean, that was the big one. I mean, there were umpteen parties at his house, which were always superb. And he knew Leslie adored champagne. It's about the only thing she'll drink. And whenever we went to his party, there was all waiters around with trays of, obviously, with champagne on. And he always, the minute he spotted Leslie coming in, Brian would, I've watched him do it, disappear, and he'd come back with an open bottle of champagne, thread his way through everybody there, and just hand it to Leslie. That is Leslie's champagne. Nobody else is to have any of that. And she used to stand with it by her feet, and that was Leslie's personal bottle of champagne from Brian. It always happened that way. He's wonderful. Brian was a great aficionado. He adored Spain and the bullfight, the corrida. Won't go into the morals of that because so did I, but he got me interested, and I still have the only present he ever gave me, which is a bullfight poster. For the very first time, I was going off to Mallorca on holiday. First time he'd had a holiday abroad, in fact. So Brian says, where are you going? So I said, oh, Mallorca, just outside Palma. And he said, oh, Alistair, I would have thought you'd have gone somewhere better than that for the bullfight. So I said, well, there's a bull ring in Mallorca. I found that out already. Oh, it's holidaymakers, that. And very derisory about the whole thing, in a nice way, in a teasing way. So we went off to Mallorca. Lo and behold, on the Sunday, first thing I found was, like, where is it? Who's fighting? And there were three whose names escape me now, to be honest, all these years on. Because it's well over 30 years. But there were three top named matadors. So I went, and it really was. It's the memorable one. I've seen quite a few since then, but that was really incredible. So I sat down and I sent a postcard to Brian saying, so much for your story about it being holiday bullfight. How about this? He said, and I just put the names of the three matadors on and sent it off to him. And I got back and I went into the office and I buzzed him through. I said, hi, Brian, I'm back. Oh, good. Down went the phone. I thought, oh, great. And a little while later, I had to go in to see him about something, catch up what was happening. And he was so aggressive toward me. And he barely could bring himself to speak. And I thought, well, what have I done? I've only been away for 2 weeks. And I said, Brian, what's wrong? Nothing. You may go. I left the office. And this went on for about 3 days. And in the end, I was getting thoroughly fed up with this. And I went in, I said, right, Brian, I want to sit down and talk to you. Why are you taking this? What happened while I was away? And he sat in that beautiful big black leather chair of his. And he said, I'm very disappointed in you. So I said, well, come on, let's clear the air. What have I done wrong? Why didn't you telephone me about that corrida? I said, what do you mean, telephone you? He said, you know I would have been on the first plane out there to see these people. He said, you've upset me. I got your postcard when it was too late. He said, why didn't you ring and tell me? You know how good they are. I would have been straight away there. And I said, Brian, is that all it's upsetting you? Yes, it is. And that was typical Brian. If I'd picked up the phone and said, hey, guess who's fighting on Sunday? And we talked it through, and he ended up laughing about it as usual. And I said, but Brian, it's a holiday island. You wouldn't have got a hotel anyway. I said, ours was bursting at the seams. I would have found somewhere. I would love to have seen that fight. You've seen anything better than I've ever seen. That's Brian. Brian was a very special guy. He could be the most awkward bugger that ever walked God's earth, but he was also, in his own funny way, the most generous. And I always remember, I hadn't been with him very long, and Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas were going to play some gigs in Stockholm, in Sweden, which I'd fixed up, and I'd organised a hotel and their flights as usual. And a couple of days before, Brian suddenly waltzes into my office and he said, Alistair, I want you to go to Stockholm with Billy and the boys. So I said, there's no point, Brian. Just in case something's gone wrong. I said, well, nothing will go wrong. I've done it. I've checked it, double-checked it. Everything's okay. There's no need for me to go. No, I insist, you go. Go for a few days. Just see everything's all right. I said, okay, fine. So I went off to Stockholm with Billy J and the Dakotas and had 5 or 6 days. I saw Marlene Dietrich with Burt Bacharach on the piano, accompanying her, would you believe? That must have been 63, something like that. And I came back and I said, Brian, everything was fine, having a good tour. Oh, fine, good. You had a good time? So I said, yes, I love it. So a few months later, we sent Sounds Incorporated out, another of our bands. Wonderful, wonderful crowd of guys. I fixed it all up through the same agent over there. And so Brian comes in again and he said, Alistair, I think you ought to go with Sounds. And I said, Brian, there is no need for me to go. I would love to, but no, I insist, you better go. Better stay the week this time. I found out quite a long time afterwards that was Brian's way of saying, have a little treat. He knew damn well that there was no need for me to go. Now, try and get a rise out of him in salary, and you could battle for weeks. But things like that, he was the most wonderful guy, and those are his little thank yous. And I can remember him. I think I found out about it because our main booker, a guy called Bernie Lee, and Brian did it for him, and Bernie would adamantly refuse to go, and Brian was so upset. And that's when I think that was the occasion when I found out that what it was, that these were his little thank yous, his little presents, and he was terribly upset that Bernie wouldn't go. I went on several like that. And when I went to my first ever trip to New York in 1964, I always remember I met him at Heathrow. He'd been over in New York, and he came over and I went to meet him. We're sitting in the limo and he said, by the way, I've got the Moody's a contract in New York. And I was the personal manager of the Moody Blues then, the original, with Denny Lane, of course. And he said, you'll love New York. And I said, what do you mean I'll love New York? He said, oh, well, you've got to go. You're their manager. So great. That was my first ever trip. Again, there was no need for me to go. But I went, and a lot of things went wrong. That was a show with Murray the K, a legendary American DJ. The Murray the K show. Oh, that was hysterical, actually. Anyway, I was there for 3 weeks, and my expenses were horrendous. And I came home and went to see Brian, and everything fine. I said, Monty's checking all my expenses. That was it. And I had a wad of them, and the company owed me some money that I'd paid out myself. And I got Monty, who was our accountant, Mr. Montgomery, wonderful guy. So he checked everything through, and yeah, that's fine. So I took them into Brian. I said, Brian, you better have a look at these. He said, why? I said, well, it's rather a lot of money. Has Monty checked them? I said, yes. Then why do you want me to check them? I said, because it's your money. I'd be happy. Nonsense. If you say that's right and Monty's checked them, it all balances, I don't want to know. Why should I? So I had this open-ended expense account. But as I said earlier, you go and try and say, Brian, I need another 100 a year. Forget it. I usually got it, but it would take weeks of negotiation. But he was such a generous man in so many ways. And his parties were absolutely wonderful. I remember when I had to ring Leslie up and tell her that Brian was dead, that Sunday morning. And the first thing she said was, over the phone, she said, oh, I'll so miss his parties. Then she burst into tears. On previous tape, I mentioned about the last time I saw Brian alive. And I'd like to take this chance of putting the record straight again, because it's almost like a record now. People say, why did Brian Epstein commit suicide? Here we go on record that Brian Epstein did not commit suicide. I've got various reasons for knowing that. A, because I was the only person there, other than the doctor, the morning I got called round to his house to find him dead. And I'd like to explain why I am so sure. One big reason was that only days before, he'd had Queenie, his mother, staying with him for several weeks because his father, Harry, had died 6 weeks earlier. And Brian adored his mother and father. And the last thing that guy would have done to his mother was to commit suicide at that time. And I got there, and Brian was just lying in bed. I was right behind the doctor. I heard the door smash down, and I went running up the stairs right behind the doctor. And I thought Brian was just asleep. And on his bed was lying a plate of chocolate digestive biscuits. And down by the side of his bed was a half-full bottle of bitter lemon drink. No alcohol to be seen. But more importantly, on the bedside table, there were about 6 or 7 pill bottles, right? All prescribed by his doctor, because Brian did need pills to wake him up, pills to put him to sleep, pills to calm him down. Now, they're all half full, and the lids were screwed back on. Now, if you're going to commit suicide by taking an overdose, you don't half do it and put the lid back on the bottle that you've taken the tablets out of. It just doesn't add up. There was no note. I've heard so many times, and I'm sick of it, how a suicide note was found and was hidden and destroyed. There were 2 people in that room the doctor and me. Nobody else. And there was no note. I've described the pill bottles, and Brian had just died. He'd taken one pill too many, and the coroner's verdict at the inquest was that it was an accidental overdose. And Brian had one particular tablet. I can't tell you what it was for, I don't know. But it had 2 ingredients in it. And it transpires that one passed through his system perfectly normally, but one was building up in his stomach. So in other words, it would have happened sooner or later, but he'd taken, I think it was 3 instead of 1, and it was just enough to tip the balance over. But he didn't take 3 to commit suicide. He took it because he thought it won't hurt. And in fact, that was the coroner's verdict, and that is one that I know. One of the saddest days of my life. And so my immediate thought was drugs. The doctor had gone downstairs to phone the police, of course. And I'm opening drawers and going through his dressing table and whatnot, and I found this enormous joint. It really was a cracker. And I've never taken drugs in my life. I had one puff on a joint once, just one puff. And I thought, I don't need this. You know, and I've been surrounded by it all those years, and I can truthfully say I never, ever, ever dabbled in drugs. And there was this enormous joint, so I put it in my pocket and forgot all about it, and the police came, and then they had to ring the coroner's office. It was a dreadful day. I had to try and get hold of Clive Epstein, his brother, who was in Liverpool, because suddenly the press were there. The doorbell went. I was with Joanne, Brian's secretary. We were having a drink to sort of just try and get over it. And we're waiting for police to come back and the coroner, because they send an awful black felt-covered coffin. It's dreadful. And suddenly the doorbell went, and I went to the door, and it was a reporter from one of the nationals. And he said, "Is Brian in?" So I said, "No." And I just thought so fast, and I said, "No, he's gone out for a walk. He's not feeling terribly well." And I was praying that, you know, the garage door was closed so they couldn't see the car or whatever. So he said, "Oh, I hear he's not very well." So I said, "Oh, he's fine." And being a damn good reporter, he said, "Well, what are you doing here on a Sunday morning?" So I said, "Well, you know what Brian's like. You know him as well as I do. He just called me over, and we'd done some business. He's gone out now." So that was that. And then a few minutes later, another reporter at the door. And I was trying to get hold of Clive Epstein, because I thought, if the press are onto this already, and it could only have come from one source, which is the police. Oh yeah, it was awful, because suddenly I looked out of the window, and there was a woman standing across the road with a baby in a pushchair, just staring at the house. Somehow she'd known, she'd heard. So it's essential that I got hold of Clive to break it to Queenie, and I couldn't get any reply. And finally I got Clive, by which time the doorbell was not stopping ringing, and Joanne was fielding it. And I finally got Clive, and before I could say anything, he just said, "Alistair, how are you? How was San Francisco? Did you have a great trip?" And I said, "Yeah, Clive, fine." I said, "I've got to tell you something." I said, "There's been an accident." And he said, "Is it Brian?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Clive, he's dead." I didn't know what else could I have said. You know, I just don't know. And he let out this most awful scream. Absolute scream. And the next second, I heard the phone sort of fall. And Barbara, his beautiful wife, came on the phone. She said, "Alistair, what's the matter?" So I told her. I said, "You must tell Queenie before it breaks." I said, "The press are here." And she said, "Leave it with us. Don't you worry. You take care. Just put the phone down." And I went round the corner. There's a little pub, and I checked it out only earlier this year, that it's still there. I think it's called the Horse and Groom, in a little mews at the back of Chapel Street. And I went there for a drink, and just to get away from the house for a bit. This reporter was there, a guy called Mike Houseago. He was one of the top showbiz writers. Great friend of ours, good lad, but a damn good reporter. And he bought me a drink, and he started me talking, and I just poured my heart out for about half an hour. And I went back to the house, and I thought, Alistair, you shouldn't have done that. That's going to be all of... I think it was the Daily Sketch he was with. I thought, you shouldn't have done that. And the next day, nothing appeared. And the next day, nothing appeared, other than the reports of Brian's death. And I met Mike a few days later, and I said, by the way, mate, are you going to use that interview you did with me? So he said, that wasn't an interview, mate. He said, that was between friends. He said, that will never appear. And it's never appeared from that day to this. And that is why I have a very, very highest regard for Mike Housego. Forever indebted to him, because it was so wonderful. But it was a bad day. And then this awful coffin arrived. There's actually a photograph on the front of I think it's the Daily Mirror, when I'm escorting the coffin into the hearse. I only saw it, I destroyed it. Somebody gave me a copy and I burnt it. I don't want reminding. One of the awful things about Brian's death was that I had to ring Leslie and tell her. Because as I'd left the house, I'd only just got back from San Francisco. I was bare feet and sandals, jeans and a denim shirt. That was it. Comfort for flying. So of course I shot off round to Chapel Street when Joanne rang me. And Leslie was not amused, because she was a bit annoyed about the way the trip to San Francisco had come about anyway. And she was not happy at all. But I had to ring her, and all I could say over the phone was, I said, love, I'm going to be here quite a while. Brian's dead. As I think I've already said, her first remark was, I will miss his party so much. And then she burst into tears. And I said, okay, pet, make yourself a cup of coffee. I'll see you when I see you. And about 45 minutes later, I suppose it would be, there's a ring at the doorbell. And I thought, here we go, another reporter. And I went to the door. And the guy that used to run the car firm that we hired cars from, a guy called Don Murfitt, super bloke. And Don was standing on the doorstep with a brown paper parcel. And he said, Leslie sent this for you. And I took it. Didn't ask him in. Couldn't, obviously. And I took it indoors and opened it. And she'd sent round a white shirt, a tie, my suit, pair of shoes, socks. A wonderful thought from a wonderful lady. In 1984, for the first time ever, I was suddenly found, as it were, and I was invited to be a guest speaker at a monster convention in America, the leading convention in America, called Beatles Fest. And I'd never, ever, ever spoken in public before, let alone about the Beatles. And I wanted the chance. It seemed too good to miss. So I said yes, and I was flown out to New York. Being stupid, I thought there'll be 500-600 people there. So on the day of the convention, on the Saturday, I was scheduled to talk for 45 minutes. And I went up to check how to get on the stage in this huge ballroom. And thought, okay, I'm not bothered. I made no notes as usual, totally unscripted, but I knew in my head what I wanted to talk about. And I went up about half an hour before I was due on stage, and in this ballroom, because I've done 12 of them now, they show films, they show videos, all sorts of things. And I walked up, and there were about 3,500 people sitting in this ballroom. Nothing else was going on. And I looked at the programme, and there was nothing else scheduled, and I thought, oh my God, they're here for me. Because apparently my name was very well known over there. I'd no idea of that at all. I thought I was the unknown man. Turns out I was mentioned in about 270 books, I think, at that time. And they were all sitting there waiting for me, and I really panicked. I thought, I can't do this. Should I? I kept quiet for over 20 years. I wouldn't do press interviews, anything. about the Beatles. And I thought, two things. One, could I do it? Two, should I do it? And I really started almost to shake. And I went downstairs. I got into the elevator, as they call it in the States, in the lift, and went downstairs. I thought, right, a golden rule I'd made myself. I would not have a drink before I went up on stage. It's a rule I keep to this day. And I went down, walked into the bar, and there were some friends there. So I have witnesses to what happened. And they were playing records over, Muzak, if you like. But it wasn't tape music, it actually was records. And I ordered half a Budweiser. And thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't go through with this. Should I be going through with it? And the record that was on stopped in mid-track. And on came a record called Georgia on My Mind by Ray Charles. It's incredible because the very first argument, not argument, but a jokey argument that Brian and I had when I first joined him, long before we'd even heard of the Beatles. I'd heard this record. And I said, right, one for each shop. We had 2 shops. And Brian heard it, and he said, right, order 500, I think it was. He said, Alistair, that's going to be a number 1. And I burst out laughing. I said, Brian, come on. I'm a great Ray Charles fan. Was then, am still. I said, it's a fabulous record. I'm going to buy the one that we're getting. I said, but never in a million years. I said, it's a jazz record. He said, I'll bet you a gin and tonic that will be number 1. And lo and behold, in that bar in New York, that's the record that came on. And I just knew Brian was there. Sorry, this is sounding very emotional. I didn't see him. I didn't hear him. And some of the people sitting alongside me, friends of mine, I suddenly heard Elaine, the wife. There was Mike and Elaine, 2 particular people. I heard her say, are you all right? And I just said, yeah, just leave me. I'll tell you later. And I never felt so much comfort. And it was Brian there saying, it's okay, you can do it. And the record finished. And I just knew. And I said, fine. And according to Mike and Elaine, I almost physically changed for those 3.5 minutes, whatever it is. And I said, okay, that's fine. Let's go. And I've never felt so confident in my life. And I went upstairs, and there were these 3,500 people sitting there. And I just rolled on from story to story, rather like I'm doing to you now. And after an hour and 45 minutes, well, I should have done 45 minutes, Mark Lapidus, who is Beatlefest, had to come on stage and say, look, I'm sorry, the whole schedule is being screwed up because I was just going on. And I came off stage, and I've done 12 more since then. That's Brian. All I can think of is Brian and me sitting in the Cavern that lunchtime, thinking there's something special, let's manage them. And they were, and we did.